November 28, 1943. The waters of the East China Sea lay dark and restless beneath a moonless sky. In the conning tower of the USS Wahoo, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton pressed his binoculars against tired eyes, scanning the horizon for the convoy his radio man had decoded from intercepted Japanese transmissions. The submarine rolled gently in the swell, diesel engines silent, running on battery power in the hunting grounds west of Kyushu. Around him, the sea stretched empty and black, but Morton knew what lay beneath the surface: a Japanese merchant fleet carrying food, rubber, and rice from the conquered territories of Southeast Asia back to the home islands. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel. Inside the pressure hull, 70 men waited in the cramped silence that precedes action, their breath condensing on cold metal surfaces, their hearts beating in rhythm with the electric motors that pushed them through the depths. Morton had been hunting in these waters for 3 patrols now, and he had developed an intimate knowledge of Japanese shipping routes, the patterns of their convoys, the predictable schedules that tied their empire together. He understood something that Japanese naval doctrine refused to acknowledge: that Japan was an island nation utterly dependent on imports, and that the thin lifeline of merchant shipping connecting the home islands to their conquered territories was vulnerable in ways their battleships were not. Below decks, the crew maintained their stations with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before. The torpedo men checked their fish for the 3rd time. The sonar operator listened to the ocean, translating its sounds into information. The plotting officer marked bearings on his chart, calculating intercept courses with mechanical precision. They were hunters preparing for a kill, but they were also something more. They were economic warriors engaged in a form of combat that the Imperial Japanese Navy had dismissed as dishonorable and ineffective. What the Japanese High Command did not yet understand, what their pre-war naval doctrine had failed to anticipate, was that these submarines would become the silent wolves that would starve their empire into submission. The battleships would claim the glory, the aircraft carriers would dominate the headlines, but it would be boats like the Wahoo, hunting in the darkness, that would cut the arteries feeding Japan's war machine until the empire bled white. The story of how submarines transformed from a weapon the Japanese scorned into the instrument of their economic destruction begins not in the waters off Kyushu, but in the doctrines and assumptions that shaped naval thinking in the decades before Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Japanese Navy, built on the traditions of surface combat and the decisive fleet engagement, viewed submarines as auxiliary weapons at best, suitable perhaps for reconnaissance or attacks on warships, but unsuited for the ungentlemanly work of commerce raiding. This was not mere cultural prejudice, it was strategic doctrine encoded in training manuals and fleet orders. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized attacks on enemy warships, particularly capital ships. Their submarines were designed for speed and range to operate with the battle fleet, to scout ahead of the main force, to deliver torpedo attacks against enemy battleships and carriers. The idea of using submarines to sink merchant vessels carrying food and fuel seemed beneath the dignity of the Imperial Navy. Commerce raiding was the tactic of weaker powers, of nations that could not meet their enemies in honest battle. Japan would win the coming war, their doctrine insisted, through decisive surface engagements, a climactic Tsushima repeated with modern weapons. This thinking was reinforced by international law and cultural attitudes. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 had imposed restrictions on submarine warfare against merchant vessels, requiring submarines to surface, verify the nature of their target, and ensure the safety of civilian crews before attacking. While these restrictions were largely abandoned by all sides once war began, they had shaped pre-war planning. Japanese naval officers viewed submarine attacks on unarmed merchants as ungentlemanly, a violation of Bushido translated into naval terms. The Americans, by contrast, had no such compunctions.
Even before Pearl Harbor, American war plans included unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. When Admiral Harold Stark issued orders on December 7, 1941, he authorized submarine commanders to sink any Japanese vessel encountered, merchant or military. The gloves were off from the first day of the war, and American submarines went hunting with clear instructions, strangled Japan's seaborne commerce. The Japanese expected that their own submarines would perform similar work against American supply lines, disrupting the flow of reinforcements across the Pacific. They expected that the vast distances of the Pacific would protect their merchant fleet, that American submarines would be too few and too poorly positioned to threaten the vital shipping lanes connecting Japan to the resources of Southeast Asia. They expected, in short, that submarines would play a peripheral role in a war decided by carrier strikes and surface engagements. They were catastrophically wrong. The campaign that American submarines waged against Japanese shipping was the most successful underwater warfare campaign in history. From 1941 to 1945, American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons, more than half of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war. They destroyed tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, freighters hauling rice from Indochina, ore carriers bringing raw materials from captured mines. They severed the connections that held Japan's far-flung empire together, cutting the flow of resources that sustained both the Japanese war machine and the civilian population. The statistics tell a story of systematic strangulation. In 1941, Japan imported 49 million barrels of oil, most of it from the East Indies fields they had captured. By 1944, oil imports had fallen to 5 million barrels. Rice imports from Southeast Asia, which fed the Japanese home islands, dropped from 2.5 million tons in 1942 to virtually nothing by 1945. Industrial production across the empire began to fail, not because of bombing, but because the raw materials never arrived. Factories stood idle for lack of coal. Power plants shut down for lack of fuel oil. The Japanese economy, built on the assumption of secure sea lanes, began to collapse. The wolf packs, coordinated groups of American submarines operating together, hunted with devastating effectiveness. They learned to read Japanese convoy schedules, to position themselves along predicted routes, to strike and disappear before escorts could respond. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey, commanding the USS Barb, developed tactics for night surface attacks that allowed submarines to penetrate convoy screens and fire spreads of torpedoes into packed merchant formations. The Wahoo, under Morton's aggressive command, pioneered the technique of penetrating inside convoys rather than attacking from the perimeter, achieving devastating hit rates. The torpedoes themselves tell part of the story, a recurring symbol of American industrial might applied to the patient work of economic warfare. Early in the war, American torpedoes were plagued with defects. The Mark 14 torpedo ran too deep. Its magnetic exploder fired prematurely or not at all. Its contact exploder often failed on direct hits. Submarine commanders filed report after report documenting failures, watching perfect setups result in duds. The Bureau of Ordnance resisted these reports, insisting the torpedoes worked as designed, blaming crew error or poor seamanship.
But the submariners persisted, conducting their own tests, documenting failures with scientific precision, demanding fixes. By mid-1943, the torpedo problems had been largely resolved. The Mark 14 became a reliable weapon, and the rate of Japanese sinkings accelerated dramatically. This was American problem-solving at its most characteristic. The willingness to admit error, to test and refine, to trust the reports of men in combat over the assumptions of distant bureaus. The Japanese, by contrast, never fixed the fundamental torpedo problems that plagued their own submarines, accepting defective weapons rather than challenging official doctrine. Those improved American torpedoes, sleek cylinders of steel carrying explosive warheads powered by compressed air or electric motors, became the instruments of Japan's slow death by attrition. Each one represented more than just a weapon. It represented an industrial system that could identify problems, implement solutions, and produce reliable equipment in massive quantities. Where Japan built 169 submarines during the war, America built 288. Where Japanese submarines sank less than 200 merchant ships, American submarines destroyed more than 1,300. The torpedo became a symbol not just of destructive power, but of systematic effectiveness, of a democracy that could outthink, outbuild, and outfight an ideology built on rigid hierarchy and unquestioned doctrine. The transformation in Japanese perception came gradually, then all at once. In 1942, Japanese naval leadership still believed submarines were a secondary concern. Merchant ship losses were noted but not alarming. The empire had substantial tonnage reserves, and Japanese shipyards were building replacements. But by 1943, the mathematics of attrition became undeniable. Ships were sinking faster than they could be replaced. Critical resources were not arriving. The fleet was forced to reduce operations for lack of fuel. Admiral Mainichi Koga, who assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death, confronted reports that painted a dire picture. The submarine campaign was not merely sinking ships, it was destroying the economic foundation of Japan's ability to wage war. Tankers carrying oil from Sumatra were being sunk before they could reach the refineries in Japan. Without oil, the fleet could not operate. Without the fleet, the empire's defensive perimeter would collapse. The submarines that Japanese doctrine had dismissed as unsuitable for decisive operations were achieving what battleships and carriers could not. They were making it impossible for Japan to sustain the war. Japanese countermeasures came too late and proved largely ineffective. The Imperial Navy had neglected anti-submarine warfare, viewing it as defensive and therefore secondary to offensive operations. They had few dedicated escort vessels, inadequate sonar and depth charge technology, and poorly trained crews. Attempts to organize convoy systems faced bureaucratic resistance and resource shortages. Merchant captains, unaccustomed to sailing in formation, struggled with the discipline required for convoy operations. Even when convoys were organized, American submarines learned to penetrate them, aided by superior radar, better torpedoes, and aggressive commanders willing to take risks. The diary of Matome Ugaki, chief of staff of the combined fleet, records the growing desperation. Entry after entry chronicles shipping losses, fuel shortages, operational cancellations. In March 1944, he wrote, "The shipping situation is critical. We cannot maintain our defensive positions without tanker deliveries, yet the tankers do not arrive. The American submarines operate with impunity, and our escort forces are inadequate to the task." By late 1944, the tone had shifted from concern to resignation. We are being strangled by degrees, and there is no remedy within our power to implement. The human cost of this strangulation extended far beyond military casualties. As rice imports from Southeast Asia dried up, food shortages in Japan grew severe. Civilian rations were cut repeatedly. Industrial workers, already laboring long hours in difficult conditions, faced increasing malnutrition. The home front, which Japanese propaganda had promised to shield, began to suffer the consequences of strategic failure. The submarines that sank freighters in the South China Sea created hunger in Tokyo and Osaka, connecting American torpedoes to empty rice bowls thousands of miles away. For the American submariners, the campaign demanded a particular kind of courage. the willingness to hunt alone in enemy waters, to spend weeks submerged in cramped quarters, to face depth charges in the crushing darkness of the deep. A submarine attacked by destroyers had limited options: go deep, go silent, and wait while depth charges exploded around the hull, each detonation a test of welds and hatches and human nerves. The casualty rate among American submariners was the highest of any branch of the U.S. military. 1 in 5 submarine sailors died in combat. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, taking their crews with them into the dark water. But they persisted, patrol after patrol, sinking after sinking, slowly tightening the noose around Japan's neck. The USS Tang, under Richard O. Kane, sank 33 ships before being destroyed by one of its own malfunctioning torpedoes on its 5th patrol. The USS Flasher sank 100,000 tons of Japanese shipping, including the carrier Shinano. The USS Barb conducted audacious raids on Japanese harbors, even landing parties to blow up coastal railways. These were not defensive operations or auxiliary actions. They were aggressive campaigns of economic destruction prosecuted with remarkable effectiveness by a relatively small force of submarines. The torpedo, that recurring symbol of American industrial and tactical superiority, appeared again and again in Japanese accounts of the war's final years. Survivors of sunken merchant ships described the characteristic trail of bubbles, the moment of recognition, the terror of knowing the torpedo was tracking true and there was no escape. For every ship that sank, there were crew members who went into the water, who clung to debris, who watched their vessel, loaded with rice or oil or ammunition, slip beneath the waves. Many of these mariners died before rescue arrived. The East China Sea and the South China Sea became graveyards for Japanese merchant sailors, thousands of them, casualties of a campaign that targeted the economic sinews of empire rather than its military forces. By 1945, Japan's merchant marine was effectively destroyed. Of the 6 million tons of merchant shipping Japan possessed at the start of the war, less than 2 million tons remained afloat, and much of that was damaged or in port for lack of fuel. The flow of resources from the southern territories had been reduced to a trickle. Factories closed, the civilian population faced starvation. The military, despite possessing millions of men under arms, lacked the fuel and ammunition to mount effective defensive operations. The final irony was that Japan had devoted enormous resources to building submarines of their own, large, sophisticated boats capable of long-range operations. But Japanese submarine doctrine, which emphasized attacks on warships, meant these submarines sank relatively few American ships and contributed little to Japan's defensive needs. The I-400 class submarines, the largest built during the war, were designed to carry aircraft for attacks on the Panama Canal, an offensive mission that never materialized while Japanese merchant shipping burned. When the war ended in August 1945, the silent strangulation was complete. American submarines had not won the war alone. No single weapon system ever does. But they had achieved something remarkable. They had severed the connections that made Japan's empire functional, cutting the flow of resources that sustained both military operations and civilian survival. They had proven that economic warfare, prosecuted with patience and precision, could be as decisive as any fleet engagement. The lesson transcended naval tactics. It spoke to the vulnerability of imperial systems, of economies built on extraction and exploitation, of nations that conquered territory without securing the means to hold it. Japan had built an empire that stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea, from Burma to the Marshall Islands, but that empire required ships to connect it, to move resources from periphery to center. When those ships began sinking faster than they could be replaced, the empire became a liability rather than an asset. Distant territories that consumed resources without contributing to the war effort.
In the Naval Academy Museum at Annapolis, there rests a Mark 14 torpedo, carefully preserved. The placard notes that this particular torpedo was never fired in anger, but thousands like it prowled the Pacific depths, their gyroscopes spinning, their warheads primed, seeking the hulls of Japanese merchant vessels. Each one represented a choice to wage war not just against armies and fleets, but against the economic systems that sustained them. Each successful hit was a calculation, a subtraction from Japan's ability to continue fighting. Those torpedoes, running true through dark water, carried more than explosive charges. They carried the accumulated wisdom of a military system that valued results over doctrine, that listened to its frontline operators, that solved problems through iteration rather than adherence to failed theories. They represented a fundamental advantage that democracy possessed over rigid autocracy, the ability to adapt, to question authority when authority was wrong, to implement solutions that contradicted official positions. The Japanese had claimed submarines were useful only for auxiliary operations, unsuitable for decisive warfare. They had built their naval doctrine on the assumption that wars would be won through surface engagements between battleships and carriers. They had neglected the unglamorous work of protecting merchant shipping because it seemed defensive and therefore inferior to offensive operations. But wars are won not just by destroying enemy forces, but by destroying their capacity to wage war. The American submariners understood this at a visceral level. Every tanker sunk was fuel that would never reach Japanese aircraft. Every freighter sent to the bottom was rice that would never feed Japanese workers. Every ore carrier destroyed was steel that would never become weapons. The campaign was patient, methodical, and utterly devastating. The wolves had starved the empire, not through dramatic battle, but through persistent hunting in the dark waters of the Pacific. They had proven that contempt for a weapon system, like contempt for an enemy, was a strategic error that could cost a war. The silent service had written its record in merchant tonnage sunk, in convoys scattered, in the slow erosion of Japan's ability to sustain its conquests. The ocean remembers what men forget. In the depths where sunlight never reaches, the hulls of Japanese merchant ships rest on the bottom, their cargoes still inside, rice turned to sludge, machinery rusted beyond recognition, the bones of crews who went down with their vessels. These are the monuments to a failed doctrine, to a naval strategy that valued honor over effectiveness, tradition over adaptation. The American submariners who sent them there are mostly gone now, their wartime service long past, their boats decommissioned or preserved in museums. But their legacy endures in the recognition that wars are complex systems, that victory requires attacking not just armies but economies, not just soldiers but the resources that sustain them. The wolf packs taught the lesson that Japan's admirals refused to learn until it was too late, that in modern war, logistics is destiny, and the nation that cannot feed its empire will watch that empire collapse regardless of how many battleships it commands. The torpedo runs true, the hull ruptures, the sea rushes in. One ship at a time, one convoy at a time, one cargo of oil or rice or steel lost forever to the depths. This is how empires end, not always in climactic battle, but sometimes in the slow accumulation of losses, in the patient work of wolves hunting in darkness, in the arithmetic of attrition that cannot be escaped once the numbers turn against you. That is the sound of inevitability, of strategic error compounded until correction becomes impossible. That is the price of dismissing weapons as useless when they are merely unconventional. And that is the power of a nation willing to wage war with all means available, to value effectiveness over tradition, and to understand that victory belongs to those who adapt fastest to the realities they face rather than the doctrines they prefer.